Hello, Anna here. We are continuing on with the spinal cord chapter and moving on to talking about with the spinal nerves, specifically the spinal reflexes. So let's go ahead and get an introduction to some of our terminology and ideas. All right, when we're looking at reflexes, we've got some things that are common to all of them. A reflex is going to be a predictable pattern of something that happens. Not only is it predictable, but it is also rapid, okay? And it's going to be specifically a rapid motor response to something, okay, to a stimulus, okay? So it's predictable, it's rapid, it does not require thought. So it's automatic. When you think of a reflex, you probably are thinking of something like when you hit your knee and your leg pops out, so the knee jerk reflex. But we also have autonomic reflexes. So you have somatic reflexes, which involve the spinal cord and skeletal muscle. Okay? But you also have what we call autonomic reflexes. And those are often an interaction either locally or with the spinal cord and various internal organs. The key thing here is that with everything, so this whole idea of predictable, all right? So it's predictable, which means the same stimulus always results in the same response. Okay? And it's, again, not something that you have to think about, so it is involuntary. It doesn't mean you can't modify it, and we'll get into that eventually, but it can be involuntary, predictable, no conscious thought. Now, when we look at reflexes, we can think about them in terms of the classic reflex arc, which is going to be using something we call serial processing. And this is the actual reflex when a reflex occurs. So you've got stimulus leading to motor response, okay? But you need to understand that your reflex has occurred. So often we have what is called parallel processing, and actually I want to leave some space for some notes up here. We have what is called parallel processing. So the actual reflex occurs, but then you need to tell your brain it happened. You need to cognitively understand that something happened, you felt pain, or your body moved in a certain way. How did it happen? And think about what you're going to do next. So you need to basically think about it. So this is the conscious awareness that the reflex happened. Now, there are some reflexes that we don't have conscious awareness of, like when we eject bile into our duodenum, you don't then get a notice to your brain saying, oh, by the way, I put some bile in there so you could digest dinner. But some have parallel processing. So with this serial processing, we can also compare and contrast this concept of a basic inborn reflex versus a learned reflex, and also learned modification to a reflex. So some example of learned reflex would be like when you learn to drive, you developed patterns where you automatically look in your mirrors, or you turn the signal on, or you know that if you see something in your peripheral vision, you need to hit the brakes so that someone doesn't hit you. Or like me, I'm really bad at using my horn. So like somebody does something and instead of hitting my horn, I just hit my brakes and I'm like, well, I probably should have let them know that they were about to like crash into me. So those are learned reflexes. So like learning to drive, but also you can do modifications, modify inborn reflexes due to like concern for others. So you have a pain withdrawal reflex. If you put your hand on a hot pan and you start to burn your hand, you will jerk it away. But that hot pan is full of scalding hot water because you're boiling eggs. And you have a toddler around your knees hanging onto you. And if you jerked your hand away, you would spill the water onto your toddler. So you don't jerk your hand away. Your conscious mind is overriding that reflex arc. So that can happen. These basic inborn reflexes, these are the ones that are automatic. They're in our genes. They're in the structure of our bodies. There are, interestingly, some reflexes we are born with that eventually go away, like the suckling reflex. And there are others that we retain our whole lives, like the knee-jerk reflex. All right, let's next go over the whole thing of the reflex arc. So here's our reflex arc section. So what is a reflex arc? It is essentially a neural pathway, or you can think of it as a neural relay, where you're going to have 2 to 3 neurons working together. Okay? Again, as I said before, these reflex arcs can be divided roughly into somatic reflexes versus autonomic or visceral reflexes. Somatic always deals with skeletal muscle. Autonomic is going to deal with, it'll deal with smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. But it'll also deal with things like our glands, like the secretion of bile or the secretion of digestive enzymes, those kinds of things. Let's go back over to our somatic reflexes. These somatic reflexes are really well exemplified by the spinal reflex. And we're going to use this as our example of what a reflex arc looks like. And essentially, a spinal reflex is going to involve the spinal cord taking in sensory information. So sensory goes to the spinal cord, and then the spinal cord sends out a motor command to a muscle. Okay? The brain can interfere. So brain can modify these spinal reflexes, as I gave in that example with not knocking the hot boiling water onto your toddler. And it can inhibit some reflexes. But if there's no reason to inhibit, these spinal reflexes go automatically. Now, when we're dealing with the reflex arc, we have several components that are important. So the components of the arc. You have the receptor. So this is the source of stimulus. So it is picking up something either outside the body or inside the body. This receptor is going to be attached to a sensory neuron. All right? The sensory neuron is going to transmit to the central nervous system. Then you have the integration center. The integration center is going to be in the spinal cord. And it's going to usually, although not always, involve an interneuron. Sometimes the sensory neuron and the motor neuron synapse without an interneuron though. So just be aware of that. Then you've got the effector. So you've got a motor neuron, which is going to affect. So that's the effector organ. And then you've got the effector. Okay. This is going to be the actual muscle fiber. So actually, let me erase what I did here. This is not the effector organ. This is the effector neuron. The muscle fiber is the effector organ. You can also have a gland be the effector. So it's whatever is actually going to do something in response to that motor neuron. So if you're drawing this out, I think I did this before where I have a little hand. And I'm actually kind of proud of that hand that's got apparently a large wart on it. Stuck itself with a knife. You're bleeding everywhere. And you've got a receptor right there. Sensory neuron comes out. You have your spinal cord. All right. Right here. So this is the dorsal root. It comes in here. All right. It will then synapse with a little interneuron. The interneuron will synapse with a motor neuron. So this is the interneuron. And this is the motor neuron. The interneuron is again where the integration center is located. And then we are back here. And the muscles of the hand jerk away from the knife that's stabbing it. Okay? So I want you to notice how I drew this out. This is something that you should draw out in your notes. And make sure you label it. And maybe write out little explanatory notes to the side. Let's look a better picture than what I drew. So right here, this is the classic withdrawal reflex or the flexor reflex. And it's what I drew by hand on the blackboard. So you got the pain stimulus. You have your sensory neuron. So right here is where the receptor would be, the nociceptor. So you're going to have a nociceptor right there. All right, signal comes in here. Here's the ganglion and the dorsal root. It's going to go into the posterior horn. It's going to synapse with the interneuron, which is the integration center. And then it's going to synapse here with my motor neuron. And it's going to go to this muscle, causing it to contract and let you off of the tack or whatever. Now, right here, this is the primary relay. So this is the first area. This is the reflex arc, okay? This, and this is the classic reflex arc. But at the same time, you're gonna, so let me actually, the parts that I did in green, this is the serial processing. Serial in that it's one step to the next step, to the next step. So it's in a linear order. But I need to know that I stepped on a pin and I need to go get a Band-Aid or I need to pull it out of my skin or I need to go get a tetanus shot. So I'm going to have a secondary pathway. So I will have right here another thing that's going to synapse and then it's going to come up and go to the brain. That is going to be the secondary pathway. And that's where you become conscious that this happened. So these spinal reflexes are all going to be also somatic reflexes. There are definitely those visceral or autonomic reflexes that I mentioned, but we'll talk more about those when we do the autonomic nervous system chapter. Now, spinal reflexes are important to medicine. We use them to find locations of damage to the central nervous system. And there are a number of tests that you will look at when you do pathophysiology where they talk about how they can use these different reflexes. The one that you're probably most familiar with is the one where they tap the tendon underneath your kneecap, so the patellar tendon, and that causes the knee jerk reflex. And that's one of the ones that we're about to talk about. So actually, we're going to talk about that next. I've got several reflexes that I want to go over in a little bit more detail. There's certainly more than what there are, more. But the ones that I need you to know for testing, the withdrawal reflex. Okay, you need to know that one. You need to know the stretch reflex, the deep tendon reflex, crossed extensor. Need to know that one. We have a few superficial reflexes. I have like one slide on it. I'm just going to kind of gloss over it, but be familiar with just whatever I've got on my PowerPoint slides. Okay, so I've already gone over the withdrawal reflex because we use that for our classic example of the reflex arc. So that's what we just did. So you have that. What I want to talk about next is going to be, let's move this up. I want to talk about the stretch and deep tendon reflexes. All right, these go together, and they're how we basically keep our skeletal muscle moving smoothly. So smooth movements of that skeletal muscle, okay? The brain needs to be aware of where your body is at all times, what amount of contraction or stretch any muscle or joint is experiencing. So we have two special receptors that we use, and these receptors are both considered proprioceptors. And they are the muscle spindle and the Golgi tendon organ. Ugh, why do I keep misspelling things? Now, these aren't just because you want to know where your body is in space. They are also what is helping to maintain good muscle tone, because it lets the reflexes determine how much you should or shouldn't be contracting. This is also very important for just maintaining posture, locomotion. It just keeps everything moving smoothly so that you don't actually have to think about what you're doing. It just reflexively does it, okay? So both of these, as I said, let me just put it in here so it's in writing. It informs the central nervous system about basically skeletal muscle stretch and contraction. Okay, so when we look at these, it's good to kind of do some kind of table that does a compare and contrast of the Golgi tendon organ versus the muscle spindle. So both of these are proprioceptors. So what do they have in common? So they're proprioceptors. Okay, ooh, I'm running out of room. Okay, but what the Golgi tendon organ is doing is it is responding to contraction. So when a muscle contracts, it triggers the Golgi tendon organ. In contrast, muscle spindles respond to stretch. So when the tissue is stretched, it sends a signal back, okay? You can also think about location. Look at the name, Golgi tendon. Guess where it's located? In the tendons, okay? Whereas the muscle spindle is actually within the muscle belly. as close to the tendon, but it's still there. Now, the Golgi tendon organ is more of a kind of a classic receptor. The muscle spindle is an interesting structure because it's not classic nervous tissue. What has happened is you have taken skeletal muscle fibers and you've modified them. So you'll take like 3 to 10 cells and you're going to bundle them up, and you're going to remove the myofilaments. So this isn't a muscle cell that can do stretch. All right, excuse me, it isn't a muscle cell that can do contraction. So it can't contract. Okay? And then again, the muscle spindle is going to send a signal to the brain if the muscle cell is stretched. And the type and rapidity of that signal is going to depend on the rate, the amount, and the degree of stretch. So you have rate, amount, and degree of stretch. All right, these are difficult for me to draw, so I have some pictures that we're going to look at next. All right, so over here, whoops, I can't see that. Actually, let's do, over here, we're going to look at this one first. What I like is they're showing you, I'm going to abbreviate this, MS, for muscle spindle. And over here, they're showing the Golgi tendon organ. And you can see that the Golgi tendon organ is embedded in the tendon. So this is the dendritic ending down here, and then it's got these lovely myelinated fibers that are going to go up towards the spinal cord. The muscle spindle itself, so you can see the skeletal muscle cells here and here. Now you can see that this looks very similar to the muscle cell, but there's no striations because you've pulled the myofilaments out. So you've modified this muscle cell so that it's still there, and when you stretch the muscle, you will change the shape. So when you stretch, it changes the shape, which means this is a mechanoreceptor because it's detecting mechanical shape change, and is a type of mechanoreceptor that is also called a proprioceptor because it's located in a muscle or a joint and it's telling the body what these structures are doing. Okay, so we're going to take this muscle spindle. So here we've got it right there, and you can see the sensory neurons that are attached to it, all right, that are going to go back and send ascending sensory information in a reflex arc to the spinal cord. Now what we're going to do is come over here, and you can see that we've got it blown up right here, and you can see the muscle during stretch versus the muscle during contraction. And when the muscle is stretched, you can see that the muscle spindle is long and skinny. But when it's not, it's big and fat and bulgy. Now come down here, and I want you to look at this table. Action potential frequency increases during stretch. So you can see you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 stimuli leading to 12 action potentials going along this sensory neuron when this is stretched. But when it's contracted, and this is all big and fat and bulgy, you've only got 1, 2, 3, 4. So a lot less stimulus when it's contracted versus when it's stretched. On the flip side, when this is tight and it's contracted, it will send a signal. So when this is not sending a signal, this is sending a signal. And when this is sending a signal, this is not sending a signal. I hope that makes sense. All right, let's look at the cute little Golgi tendon organ, all blown up, so you can see the dendritic endings here. This is where the receptors will be located, and you can see the cute axon with all the little Schwann cells forming the myelin sheath, and you can see how it's arranged over the tendon. I also like the way they show the tendon bundles mirroring and mimicking the shape of the muscle cells, which is a very characteristic of tendon, whereas ligaments look very different because they do not arrange themselves in the same types of bundles. All right, let's look at the next picture. We're going to look at the stretch reflex next. All right, now that we've reviewed the Golgi tendon organ and the muscle spindle, we can actually talk about how they work with that stretch reflex, and then the knee jerk reflex, and then the Golgi tendon reflex, which are all variations on the same thing, okay? So I have right here a knee. Okay, you see right here? And we're going to do knee flexion, which means this hamstring muscle is contracting and the quadriceps muscle is stretching. So I have right here a muscle spindle embedded in the belly of the quadriceps. And remember, muscle spindles respond to stretch. So when this muscle spindle is stretched, it sends a signal along the sensory pathway into the dorsal root, into the dorsal horn, right here to the integration center. And they're showing two different structures, one where the sensory neuron synapses directly with the motor, and here where there's an interneuron in the middle. Both of these are just classic normal reflex arcs. So we're going to go with the blue line over to the red line first. And what you will see is along this motor pathway, it is an excitatory signal to the quadriceps telling it to contract. So I want you to remember back to when we studied muscles and we talked about the agonist versus the antagonist. So the question is, well, if you're contracting the agonist for knee flexion, why does this other muscle contract? This other muscle contracts because of this stretch reflex. So the blue sensory neuron synapses with the red sensory neuron, and that red motor neuron tells the quadricep muscle to contract in response to this, so that this muscle resists that muscle movement. Isn't that clever? And then if we follow the second pathway, the blue, at the same time, synapses with the purple line, which is going to come over here. This one is inhibitory, so it fights against the flexion agonist, and it's saying, okay, we're done. Would you please relax? You don't need to contract anymore. Okay? I think that basically explains it. Let's look at the knee jerk reflex, which is a variation of the stretch reflex. So here we're looking at it, and what you're seeing now is instead of the person flexing their knee, they are taking a hammer and they're tapping the patellar tendon. When you tap the patellar tendon, you stretch that muscle spindle. So there is still a muscle spindle right in here that responds to stretch. That sends a sensory signal along this pathway. It's going to synapse here, and it's going to do the same thing it did on the other thing. I've got a red line here that's going to come to the antagonist muscle, telling it to contract. And along the purple line, I have an inhibitory signal that's telling the hamstring muscle to relax. The result, since this wasn't contracting to begin with, is the knee pops up, all right, and the leg kicks. All right, let's look next at the Golgi deep. All right, when the stretch reflex is working, the Golgi tendon reflex is also working. They are complementary. So complementary with the stretch reflex. They go together. Okay, so we've got our knee right here, and we are going to do, what are we doing? Muscle contraction. We are going to be doing extension. So we are now doing, so if we're contracting that, we are doing knee extension because we are contracting the quadriceps. Okay, so when I do that, right there in the tendon is the tendon organ. And if you remember, the Golgi tendon organ responds to contraction. Okay? So that is going to send a signal. This is going to respond to the contraction, send a signal to the sensory pathway into the dorsal root. Going to have two synapses. The red line right here is going to be inhibitory to the agonist, saying, okay, relax, you don't need to do extension anymore. The purple line is going to come over here and go to the hamstring muscle and tell it to contract as the antagonist. All right, resisting the extension being caused by the quadriceps femoris. So you can see that when the muscle spindle is working one direction, the Golgi tendon reflex is working with the other direction, and both are firing at the same time for opposite reasons. So if the Golgi tendon organ is working right here, I have muscle spindles in here that are responding to stretch and triggering the stretch reflex, so that both of them are co-occurring. All right, so this little drawing, which did not convert well into the PDF, is demonstrating the two reflexes working together. So I have extension of the rectus femoris, which is going to cause muscle stretch of the rectus femoris, which is going to trigger the muscle spindle. That's going to send a sensory signal to the spinal cord. Now this is going to then go and do these steps, where the muscle cord is going to do, is going to trigger that tendon reflex at the causing ultimately the rectus femoris to stop contracting. Whereas over here, you are going to have the contraction of the biceps femoris triggering the Golgi tendon organ, which is responding to contraction. That sends a signal to the spinal cord, which then sends an inhibitory signal back to here, telling it to stop. So they're both functioning at the same time, triggering opposite things in the agonist and the antagonist. I hope that makes sense. This is something that I recommend that you draw out using one of these pictures or your own picture to show how the stretch reflex and the deep tendon reflex complementarily work together. I don't know if that was actually a word. Anyway, let's look next at the cross extensor. So the cross extensor reflex is really about maintaining balance. And you can pair it with the withdrawal reflex to get away from a nasty stimulus and not fall over at the same time. So we'll use the cross extensor reflex when we're walking. I don't know if you walk, you notice that when you take your arms swing back and forth, extension is on the opposite side. So in this particular example, they're showing another way that the cross extensor reflex works. So you have someone right here and the arm is grabbed. The cross extensor reflex causes this to go back in flexion, while it triggers this to go forward in extension to push away the stimulus. So if we're looking at these, you're dealing with muscle spindle and Golgi tendon organs. Again, all right, so you got your stimulus here, comes along the pathway here, and then it's going to synapse there. It's going to come out, we'll follow the purple pathway right here. This is going to inhibit this muscle, and it's going to come over here and excite this muscle, causing the flexion of the elbow. At the exact same time, I want you to notice this little component right here. This is awesome. Look at this. So I've got a synapse here, all right? I have a synapse there, but I have a third synapse right here. So the exact same time, this signal is crossing over and working with those motor neurons to do the opposite action, so that right here, it comes out and it inhibits the brachialis and biceps brachii. And then it comes here and it triggers the triceps brachii, causing extension of the elbow to push away the nasty stimulus. All right. All right, so let's just, I don't have any pictures for superficial reflexes, so let's just go to the blackboard and we'll take a few notes. So these superficial reflexes, the few that I'm interested in for you to know, these are all gentle, cutaneous stimuli reflexes. So basically, they are caresses on the skin, okay? And we can use these for looking for spinal cord or cerebral cortex damage. So one of them that I find interesting is the plantar reflex. And when you do the plantar reflex, you're checking if there's damage at L4 to S2 spinal nerves. So basically, you're going to take the bottom of your foot, so the sole, actually that's not how you write sole, wrong word. How about we use our proper words, plantar surface of the foot. So you're going to basically take the tip of your finger or the tip of your nail and you're going to stroke the lateral side of the bottom of the foot. And hopefully the toes will flex. And that's what you're looking for. If you get the Babinski sign, that is what can be indicative of 1, pathology, 2, baby, your baby. Babies are all born with the Babinski sign. Or 3, a developmental delay. Okay, so basically with the Babinski sign, when you do the plantar reflex test, the big toe dorsiflexes and the other toes fan laterally. All right, and if you've got a baby, you can do this at home. It's fun. So it's common in babies less than 1 year of age. All right, most babies have it. Most adults who have it, it's a sign of spinal cord damage, okay, or damage to the spinal nerves. However, and I learned this with my kids, some kids with developmental delays, kids with autism, attention deficit disorder, cerebral palsy, they will often retain the Babinski sign, 10, 11, 12, and it's not a sign of any damage. It's just that this inborn reflex has not integrated. And with occupational therapy or physical therapy, it can be integrated with certain reflex or certain exercises over a period of time. Okay, let's look at one more that's fun because you can do it on yourself. The abdominal reflex. And the abdominal reflex is checking the nerves for spinal nerve, the eighth thoracic spinal nerve through the T12 spinal nerve. And what you do is you're going to lightly caress the belly. So caress the belly, kind of nearish the belly button. And if the belly button or umbilicus twitches toward the stimulus, that is a sign of the abdominal reflex. Okay. That is all I'm going to say on those reflexes, and I will go ahead and stop the recording now.